And now, ladies and gentlemen, a few words of wisdom by the guest of honor of this ceremony, Professor Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, President of the International Movement for a Just World.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Professor Dr. Israj bin Haji Saruddin, covering rector of the International Islamic University, Mr. Mahmudur Rahman, author of the book we are launching, former advisor to the Bangladesh government, Associate Professor Dr. Shukran Abdul Rahman, Dean Kuliah of Islamic Revealed Knowledge and Human Sciences, guests of honor, deputy deans, heads of department, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this event for this very kind invitation. I'm honored and privileged to be here with you as a speaker on an occasion which I value a great deal because it is linked to the launch of a book, and a book which is undoubtedly a masterpiece. Before I share my views with you, let me make a little correction. In your brochure and in your introductory remarks, you refer to me as professor. I'm no longer a professor. I retired as Professor of Global Studies from USM about 7 years ago. So it is not really right to use that term. I want to tell you a little joke in relation to this. It's a little naughty in a sense, but it's a joke worth sharing. This is the joke about a Singapore family. They decided that their aged father, who was finding Singapore a little too claustrophobic, should spend some time in Johor Bahru, and brought him over to Johor Bahru. A man who was advanced in age. And after 5 or 6 months, the son and daughter-in-law came to Johor Bahru to take him back to Singapore, because they thought that he had spent some time already, in this different environment. But the man did not want to follow them back. He said, I like it here. I want to continue to stay in Johor Bahru. There's something special about this place. Even if you are not associated with a certain role, they still continue to respect you. For instance, he told his son and daughter-in-law, there's someone in this neighborhood who is a former teacher. He doesn't teach anymore. He hasn't been teaching for a long time, but they still call him Chegu. The respected term for a teacher, Chegu. We have a judge in this neighborhood, someone who was once a judge. It's no longer a judge. It's not made a single judgment for 15 years. But they still call him Young Arif, term of respect for judges. We have got a general, former general here, who has not commanded an army for 20 years, but they still call him general. You've got a former ambassador here who has not served in any position as an ambassador. They still continue to call him ambassador. And the same thing with a former professor. And they still continue to call him professor even though he has not been a professor for quite a while. And this old man, he told his son and daughter-in-law, and you know, like in my case, he said, you know, I've not had sex for about 20 years, this old man, he said. But, you know, the people here, they still call me that, you know, the four-letter word, add ing, Singaporean. So, in other words, what you're saying was that even if you're not playing a particular role, they continue to respect you for whatever you have done in the past. Now, I know you would have caught the joke, but I don't think I should go into details. So this is the thing about referring to people in terms of their former role, you know, so perhaps it doesn't really matter how one addresses me. I'm glad to be here. And I want to say this, that as a student of politics, I found Mahmudur's book remarkable. It's full of historical insights. It is a book which explores what is really a vital challenge facing humankind today, the question of identity. The question of identity is a global challenge. It is a question that has evolved over time. We are confronted with new dimensions in this issue of identity. And Mahmudur has explored this in the context of one particular nation, how that space, that is Bangladesh today, Bengal in the larger sense, had acquired a Muslim identity. While he has touched on so many different dimensions of this very critical issue, I would like to draw your attention to just two, if I may, in his book. Number one, he looks at the challenges to the preservation and expression of Muslim identity in Bangladesh today. And the two challenges that he talks about, one is secular authoritarianism, which I think is the term he uses in his book. Secular authoritarianism or authoritarian secularism. I think it's authoritarian secularism, the term that he uses, describing a particular type of secularism, authoritarian secularism. And number two, he talks about the geopolitical realities that challenge Bangladesh's Muslim identity. I want to touch on these two very quickly, if I may. The challenge of secular authoritarianism, which in the case of Bangladesh, especially in the last few years, it has taken a hideous form. Suppression, marginalization, the imprisonment of people, their torture, their elimination, not widely reported in the mainstream media, but quite pervasive. This has enabled a particular regime to perpetuate its power. Now, this phenomenon that he talks about, authoritarianism, let us remind ourselves, is not confined to secular regimes. Any regime, whatever its label, whatever its ideology, can be authoritarian, and it can be brutal in its authoritarianism. And it is incumbent upon us to acknowledge, as Muslims, that there is also such a phenomenon as Islamic authoritarianism. It can happen, and it has happened. That in the name of Islam, even if it contradicts the finest, the most noble teachings of the religion, in the name of Islam, you can have authoritarianism. You can even have fascism in the name of our religion. This is the reality. And if we are honest in our scholarship, we must be prepared to acknowledge this, that this can also happen. You can have secular authoritarianism, you can have religious authoritarianism. And the only way to deal with it is for people to stand up, to speak out against this challenge. Whether it is secular or religious, the response to this type of authoritarianism is more or less the same. One must have the courage. One must have the courage, one must have the integrity to speak up, to defend certain values and principles, and to expose the wrongdoings. Because if you look at the impact of wrongdoings, it doesn't matter what ideological label one uses, the impact upon human beings. A person who is tortured, a person who is jailed, a person who is expelled, exiled, a person who is killed, the impact is the same. Which is why I think we must stand up against authoritarianism. I see that as one of the messages of the book. And this is what Mahmudur has done all his life, within the context of his own country. He has played a role which is praiseworthy, to say the least. He has spoken up, he has stood up, he has paid the price. He's been to jail for periods of time, and he has continued to uphold his principles. So that, I think, is the challenge that one faces in confronting authoritarianism. The other challenge is the challenge of geopolitical forces at work in any situation. And in the context of Bangladesh, it is perhaps a little more challenging than in some other situations, though it is not unique in that sense, because different countries are faced with different geopolitical challenges. In the case of Bangladesh, partly because of the role that India played in the 1971 liberation of East Pakistan, and this is mentioned in Mahmudur's book, you find that India has sought to dominate Bangladesh, just as it has sought to dominate the rest of South Asia, which is one of the reasons, and I've written about this before, it's one of the reasons why SAARC, the Southeast Asian Regional Cooperation entity, one of the reasons why it has not really succeeded is because of the tendency, the determination on the part of the Indian elite to want to dominate the region. You just have to compare and contrast SAARC with ASEAN to understand this difference. We also have a huge country within ASEAN, and that's Indonesia, whose population dwarfs the populations of the other countries. But analysts of ASEAN will tell you that Indonesia, even when it was under an authoritarian regime for a long while, 32 years, it never sought to dominate ASEAN. It embarked upon this whole process of consultation, so much a part of our tradition, Mushawara, that sort of tradition, trying to seek consensus. And as a result of that, the other smaller countries in ASEAN felt comfortable. So this tendency to dominate is the geopolitical reality that confronts Bangladesh and other countries, Maldives, Nepal, Bhutan, even small countries now, they're beginning to react. And this is something which we must keep in mind. Whenever we talk about regional formations and regional politics, the one dangerous trend is the quest for hegemony or dominance on the part of one or two members who are much more powerful than the others. And I think Mahmudur has discussed this with a great deal of honesty in his book about this challenge that confronts Bangladesh. And it's made worse, and especially in the last 2 decades perhaps, with the sort of alliance that has developed between India and the US. Partly because of other geopolitical developments, the so-called threat of terrorism and the attempt to link the terrorism with Islam, and therefore any nation which seeks to establish an Islamic identity is suspect. And various Muslim groups, whether they're terrorists or not, become suspect. So you have a situation where this attempt to divide the world into us versus them, using this particular dichotomy, becomes a very big problem. And countries like Bangladesh, in a sense, have been victims of this. And this is what we have witnessed. And if I may add, though this is not highlighted in Mahmudur's book, the US's alliance with India, which has contributed to this very complicated situation, has been made worse in recent times by the devious, sinister role played by Israel. Israel, as you know, is a huge supplier of arms to India. She supplies not only arms to India, she also helps India, so it is said, in counter-terrorism. Because of her experience with the Muslims in that part of the world, in West Asia, somehow Israel feels it has the right to provide expertise, advice to India on how to deal with terrorism. And you can see the consequences of that. Indo-Pakistani relations, attitude towards Bangladesh, and so on. So this is the challenge. The role of Israel has made it worse in this equation. How do you overcome this? I want to be very brief about this. It's a huge challenge. How to overcome geopolitical realities of this sort. I suppose we have to make people aware. Not many people are aware of this nexus between India, the US, and Israel. We have to make people aware. We have to write about it, we have to speak about it. And you'll find that the mainstream media will not entertain you. But nonetheless, I think it is very important. It is very important that we highlight this. I think it is also equally important that we make people aware that we should distinguish, make a very clear distinction between the type of militancy that we see in different parts of the world perpetrated by different groups, including what had happened in Colombo a couple of days ago. We have to distinguish that sort of militancy from the quest for genuine expression of identity. We must be able to do that. And for us Muslims, it's a very big challenge because there is a tendency to conflate genuine expression of identity with senseless, mindless violence and put the blame upon our religion and upon our people. That, I think, is another major challenge that we face, both at the intellectual level and at the level of mass education and mass mobilization. We also have to make sure that we govern our societies well. That's very important. Don't give an excuse to anyone. Govern well, meaning by which eradicate corruption, establish governments that are trustworthy. That's a very big challenge. And if we can do that, then I think the Muslim world has more than a chance of emerging as a civilization that can confront and overcome the challenges that we face today, people everywhere. And this is, I think, the message I would like to convey on behalf of Mahmudur's book, that we should reach out for that. We should reach out for the stars. And Islamic civilization has a role to play, more today than at any other time. I used to tell my students, if we are puzzled by the whole question of identity, actually the answer is in the Quran. The question of identity. The Quran is the only scripture that I know that acknowledges the importance of individual, cultural, and religious identity. It's there. You cannot eradicate it. It is part of Allah's divine plan. But at the same time, it is also that one scripture that tells us that we are one family. Humanity is one. There is a certain human consciousness and a certain human bond that we must also develop. And if we can understand that by reading his book, then I think we would have benefited ourselves and our fellow human beings. Thank you.